Now we have another treat. We're going to introduce Gordon Urquhart, who will be well known to most of you. Gordon originally hails from New York, but has lived for many, many years in Glasgow, is an architecture historian, and has got a tremendous detailed expertise about Glasgow's architectural history, and particularly that of the West End. So this marvellous book, of course, All Along Great Western Road, and that has been followed by a new publication, which Karen alluded to, specifically about this church, which I've forgotten to bring up to show you. So, there we go. Forget that last few seconds. This wonderful book, signed copies are available at the side, of A Notable Ornament, Lansdowne Church, an icon of Victorian Glasgow. And you can see by the impressive thickness of this work, which runs to 250 pages, that the story of Lansdowne Church and the circumstances leading to its construction and its completion were somewhat fraught and complicated. So we're going to get from Gordon what I'm sure will be a fascinating synopsis of the story of this great work by John Honeyman. So thank you very much, Gordon Urquhart.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for the plugs, and the check is in the post. It's a pleasure to be back here at Lansdowne Church within a black box. Although I should really be calling it Webster's Theatre now, but whatever its name now and in the future, this building will remain a special place. In fact, I'd call it a glorious place, not only for its architecture and its stained glass, as we've been hearing about, but also as an iconic feature in the townscape of Glasgow. Is my clicker working? Clicker is essential. There we go. Having been asked to give a potted history of the building of John Honeyman's Lansdowne United Presbyterian Church, I'd like to outline how the building came to be and discuss the people involved in its creation and its management over the years, and discuss sort of the scene, setting the scene for the installation of Alf's famous stained glass windows almost a century ago. But one of the most interesting things about this church is that it's always been closely associated with its founding minister, the Reverend Dr. John Eadie, arguably the most prominent and influential Glasgow churchman in the 19th century. My clicker is stalling. There we go. There's Dr. Eadie. The fact that Lansdowne has long been associated with Eadie, apparently for generations after his death, it was still known as Dr. Eadie's Church, has probably less to do now with his esteemed scholarship than the rather unfair accusation that he forsook the poorer congregants in his former charge in Cacadens in favor of the wealthy parishioners in the fashionable West End. Today, this association with Dr. Eadie is probably best remembered because of those cheeky lines of doggerel that were allegedly chalked on the pavement outside the church on Lansdowne Church's opening day. These lines have been repeated in many a Glasgow history book over the years, but rarely is there any context or explanation. And as with so many of these old historical chestnuts, there's usually a much more complicated story lurking in the archives. So in examining how Lansdowne came to be, I'd like to discuss not only Dr. Eadie himself, but also the founding congregation. For of course a church is more than just a structure. It is those people who infuse the building with spirit. And of course the Lansdowne Church story and the story of his congregation does not originate here on this riverside site in the West End. It begins a mile to the east. Here we are at Woodside, and it really begins in this neighborhood of Cacadens, then just the northwest hinterland of Glasgow. So a bit of a backstory. For centuries, Cacadens was a relatively isolated agricultural hamlet, showing up in Timothy Pont's map of the 1590s, and also being seen quite clearly well outside the town in General Roy's map from the 1750s. In the early years of the 19th century, Cacadens remained a quiet clachan tucked between Garnet Hill and Port Dundas, though the burgeoning industrial city was rapidly approaching, in particular due to the increasing activity around the Forth and Clyde Canal. You can see Port Dundas. Foundries, factories, and other small enterprises attracted new residents. In general, the working classes were housed amidst the industrial sites to the north, while the professional or middle classes were populating the new gridiron streets of Garnet Hill and Blythswood. and with such rapid growth, the expanding population of the old Cacadans village would soon require amenities such as schools and churches. In October 1834, members of the various secessionist congregations around the northwest of Glasgow grouped together and engaged architect John Baird to construct a modest but solidly classical preaching box on a restricted site in the newly formed Kelvinbridge Street. According to one contemporary, quote, "It was so placed as to realize, better than most ecclesiastical edifices, the ideal of a church in which the rich and the poor should meet together. Rich worshippers from the terraces and the crescents met in the same sanctuary, crowds of working men and their families who came from the streets and lanes of Cacadans and Port Dundas. Surprisingly, this new church went without a permanent pastor for many months after its opening, before happenstance introduced the congregation to a new divinity graduate from the University of Glasgow, John Eadie. The newly licensed Reverend Eadie, a native of Alva in Clackmannanshire, was on the verge of taking up his first appointment in a country church in 1835 when destiny was forever changed. His destiny was forever changed. Apparently, young Eadie bumped into a fellow graduate, also recently licensed, who was scheduled to preach at 2 Sunday services in the new Kelvinbridge Street Church. Eadie's acquaintance felt wholly unable to take up the appointment, and Eadie offered to trade his country engagement for the Kelvinbridge Street services. According to Eadie's biographer, to this suggestion his friend agreed, so on that Sabbath, Dr. Eadie preached to the small and young cause at Kelvinbridge Street. His services that day gave great satisfaction, and the congregation recognized in him the right man, and at once applied for permission from the presbytery to appoint Eadie as his permanent minister. But for this accidental encounter and his generous offer to help a friend, Eadie might have accepted his first call from that country church. Instead, Eadie became the inaugural minister of the Kelvinbridge Street United Secession Church, where he would stay for the next 28 years. Of course, Dr. Eadie's Cacadans is no longer recognizable. By the late 19th century, it had some of the worst deprivation rates in the city, and after the Second World War, it was amongst the highest priority comprehensive development areas, and was also directly in the path of the new Inner Ring Road. And just to show you the site of the Kelvinbridge Street Church, you can see here how the building is tightly packed in between the bend and Kelvinbridge Street. Of course, Kelvinbridge Street now sort of terminates there. And the old Cacadan Street, which is an old country road going up to the northwest hinterland. Of course, this area was thoroughly raised and rearranged in the 1970s with a reconstructed Cacadans Road and new tenements usurping the bend in Kelvinbridge Street. So it used to sit approximately there in the middle of the road now. Eadie's popularity and the success of the young church grew exponentially. In his first 25 years as pastor, the membership at Kelvinbridge Street increased from 60 to well over 1,000. It seemed like the young minister and the growing population of Cacadans were a perfect fit. According to his friend and biographer, Reverend Dr. James Brown, the very fact that Eadie was at heart a village boy made him very comfortable in the overgrown village of Cacadans. Quote, "This feature of Cacadenbridge congregation that, though a city charge, it was, at least in the early days of its history, to a large extent a village church, in which there was much of the simplicity and kindliness characteristic of village life, making it a specially congenial sphere of work for Dr. Eadie. He was, to the end, essentially a villager. He liked to know his neighbors. He took kindly cognizance of their family histories. Peculiarities of character, which come to the front most readily in such districts as Cacadans, before it had been swallowed up by the city, deeply interested him. The people among whom he was called to labor suited him, and he suited them. As his flock grew, Eadie engaged with the poorer element of the community with great enthusiasm. Quote, "It was to Eadie in the earlier years of his ministry that the poor people of Cacadans, which had no church connection, came to for their marriages and their burials, and it was mainly by the agencies connected with his church that their spiritual interests were cared for. As early as the beginning of 1836, while the congregation was still small and heavily burdened with debt resting on their new building, a missionary was engaged to labor in the poorer districts. All the missionary operations were conducted under Eadie's immediate superintendence, and all his workers had not only his sympathy, but his active cooperation. So, under Eadie's direction, the church established Sabbath schools in the deprived areas around Kirkcaldy and north towards Portendas and Springbank, with numbers growing from 5 schools and 20 teachers and 200 pupils in 1848 to 8 Sunday schools, 800 pupils and 80 teachers by the time Eadie left for Lansdowne 15 years later. Other charity work included the distribution of clothing to the poor and destitute, the forming of a congregational library, and a juvenile missionary society providing medical and spiritual needs abroad. So Dr. Eadie was also making his mark at this time, pause, in theological circles at a relatively early age. Pausing again. I'll keep clicking and tell me if it changes. He was appointed chair of biblical literature and exegetical theology at Divinity Hall in Edinburgh at age 33, a post that he would hold until his death. His work as a scholar and professor would soon bring him widespread popularity, respect, and a certain amount of fame. He was a prolific writer on biblical and other religious matters, with many of his works becoming standard text across the English-speaking world. One contemporary asked rhetorically, "And who has not heard of Dr. Eadie? Into what corner of the land has his biblical cyclopedias and concordances penetrated? Among scholars, he is looked up to for his able exegetical works, by far the best ever produced in Britain. In the professor's chair, he is quite at home, being a great favorite with the students, astonishing them with his immense stories of philological lore, with a bright, humorous sally, or by pronouncing some passages all beautiful with the flowers of rhetoric and poetry. Dr. Eadie is also a favorite with the Glasgow people. Either in the pulpit or on the speaking platform, he can always secure a large audience." And incidentally, when his 13th edition of the Biblical Cyclopedia was published in 1872, it was noted in the preface that it had sold 24,000 copies since 1848, more than 1,000 a year for about a quarter century. And Eadie's publications were not strictly exegetical or analytical studies of the Bible, but they included a wide range of works, including histories and biographies. Copies can still be found in libraries around the world, such as these from Princeton and Ontario, and even the Library of Congress in Washington. Of course, Eadie was well known in American church circles and was invited there on many speaking tours. On one trip, it was reported in the New York Times that Dr. Eadie was in attendance at the funeral of former Secretary of Treasury and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court Salmon P. Chase. On another occasion, he was invited to the White House for a private audience with President Ulysses S. Grant. Of course, Grant was admittedly very keen on his own Scotch heritage in more ways than one. And even to this day, more than a century and a half since they were first published, many of Eadie's works are still in print in the US, both in traditional book form and in multi-volume CD-ROM bumper sets. That's a steal at $199.95. And they're still garnering rave reviews. Everything that John Eadie writes is pure gold, says the Banner of Truth USA. At his 25th Jubilee service in 1860, Eadie was presented with a silver tray and 300 sovereigns from the Cambridge Street congregation as a mark of their esteem. Yet only 3 years later, he chose to leave his flourishing church. Although he had been invited over the years to take up desirable posts in more salubrious Edinburgh ministries, when he did leave Kirkcaldy, he went just a mile along the Great Western Road to what was then a relatively sparsely populated area. For centuries, these lands to the west of Glasgow were not much more than the home of isolated country houses, small farms, and the occasional bleach field, coal pit, or sandstone quarry. There were many ancient mills along the Kelvin, of course, most around Partick, but many more upstream. And those at Woodside, North Woodside and South Woodside, being used variously for grain, paper, and cotton processing, amongst other things, over the centuries. After a premature start for housing development in the 1820s, local landowners such as James Gibson of Hillhead came to realize that improved transport links for the city were crucial to promote residential development in the area. The 1836 Act to build a private turnpike road from the city out to Anniesland, along with a high-level crossing of the Kelvin, opened up Hillhead and the neighboring states of Kelvinside and Downhill. Despite the new bridge and the turnpike, the area west of the Kelvin remained mostly rural through the 1840s, and suburban development was piecemeal at best. From the 1850s, however, developers began taking up feuds and housing was being built, primarily in grand terraces fronting Great Western Road. Naturally enough, these new superior classes of housing attracted the up-and-coming businessmen and professionals from the congested city, including many congregants from Dr. Eadie's church in Cambridge Street. Of course, once the new population reached a critical mass, new institutions such as churches and schools would have to follow, as it had done in Kirkcaldy a generation earlier. Incidentally, not all the grand plans for the West End were ever realized. One monumental scheme that never came to fruition was Charles Wilson's proposals for a magnificent crescent at Belmont, directly opposite the future site of this church, designed remarkably similar to his contemporary work at Park Terrace and Kelvin Grove Park, with its grand staircase and tall mansarded townhouses. But it's interesting to note that the new Great Western Turnpike, had it kept to its original proposed line, this site for Lansdowne Church would never have been available. The original turnpike was meant to sweep to the north to avoid obstructing the South Woodside Mill Lade and Mill Weir and the old estate bridge over the Kelvin. But after protracted negotiations and haggling with the mill owners and tenants, the road trustees decided to build a more expensive and much larger bridge that would effectively leapfrog over the weir, the lade, and the bridge and provide a straight run across the Kelvin rather than sweeping to the north. So thankfully, this little site on the corner, very prominent and conspicuous site as it was called, became available for the church trustees some years later. A bit washed out. You can just probably make out Great Western Road at the bottom here, and here's our site. For many years, the members of various UP, United Presbyterian congregations, of course by this time the United Secessionists had become United Presbyterians, but that's a whole other lecture. The genealogy of the Church of Scotland, I'll leave that for others on another time. UP members had been looking for a site for the church, for a new church in the West End, but by the 1850s, many of the sites were too expensive. The ground conditions were quite problematic. There were hillside sites or made ground sites. So nothing really came to pass, and really there weren't really enough UP families west of the Kelvin to warrant a new building until 1850s and into the early 1860s. When these breakaway members from Cambridge Street found this site, decided on this site at Kelvinbridge, it just so happens that Dr. Eadie's manse from Cambridge Street was around the corner in Lansdowne Crescent. So things are beginning to fall into place here. So how did Eadie come to leave Kirkcaldy and the Cambridge Street Church? Can somebody get that phone, please, and take a message? How did he come to leave Cambridge Street and his flourishing congregation after more than 25 years in post? Well, it all started, again, in a sort of happenstance way, this time on a particularly rainy Sabbath in 1861. And Eadie recalled this a chance encounter. He wrote some years later, he bumped into a member of the Cambridge Street congregation who lived in Hillhead. And Eadie happened to say to him, "You were not in church yesterday afternoon." And the reply came back, "How could we? The day was so wet and stormy." Then I said Eadie, "You must get a church for yourselves out west someplace, sometime." And his answer took the form of a question, "If we did, would you come and be the minister?" My response being, I would take it into very favorable consideration. So Eadie always claimed that he merely wished to pursue church extension, with the purpose of joining Lansdowne being, quote, simply to supply a new and growing district of the city. And it's possible also maybe that at age 52, he simply desired a change after spending his entire preaching career at Cambridge Street. And perhaps it's because Kirkcaldy was no longer the small village parish that he'd first pastored in his 20s. As a theologian of international renown, Eadie might have been simply growing weary of suffering the limitations, if not the indignities, of Baird's modest building in Cambridge Street, with its compact sanctuary and its vestment down in the basement. Apparently, to reach the pulpit at Cambridge Street from the basement vestry, he had to climb up a steep set of stairs and enter through a trap door, with his head appearing first to the assembled masses. And Dr. Eadie used to say that as he carried his sermons up that stair, he felt as if he were making the ascent up a hangman's scaffold. Rough crowd in Cambridge Street. Eadie apparently was stung by the criticism that he was turning his back on the poor in order to establish a wealthy new congregation in the western suburbs. He wrote at the time, "The accusation is without true grounds. A church without poor has a defective constitution. The fact, on the one hand, is that the new locality is inhabited chiefly by persons in a better social position, but the fact, on the other hand, is that the one locality where many of our poorer members live, that is Springbank up by the canal, is considerably nearer to the new church than the old. I know, too, that not a few of this class will be found in the new church, and they will be specially welcome." Once opened, the new Lansdowne UP congregation continued with those charitable activities first established from Cambridge Street, with both churches sharing sponsorship of the city mission in Springbank. To this end, in the early years, the Lansdowne membership raised sums for local charities amounting to more than 3 times the value of the construction debt for Lansdowne Church. When Honeyman's building opened in December 1863, the popular trade described it as a prominent and elegant structure, among the handsomest of Gothic edifices in the West End, and a notable ornament. Good name for a book. And it was a building that materially adds to the beauty and adornment of the city. The exquisiteness of the architecture was certainly not lost on Dr. Eady, who used a passage from Isaiah as a theme for his opening sermon, that being, "I shall make the place of my feet glorious." Worthy of a pause. So very shortly, the new congregation became established at Kelvinbridge, and the church began to grow, and soon became a visual and cultural landmark on the western edge of the city. But who were these congregants from Cambridge Street that enticed the great beloved Dr. Eady away from Calcaddon's? In the end, only 68 members from Cambridge Street were formally disjoined by the UP Presbytery, a mere 6% of the total congregation. They were, on the whole, professional or mercantile men and their families, with addresses in the new terraced houses and villas in the western suburbs. As one would expect, there were leading lawyers and accountants and bankers and manufacturers and publishers. Some of these men were also involved in the Glasgow Town Council or other city institutions. Many contributed liberally to the construction of the building and also its fitting out. For example, Thomas Struthers here on the left, he was an upholsterer. He provided curtains that were used to cover up the blank transept windows for many, many years. Not surprisingly, for a city like Glasgow, a number of the trustees and the elders in the new congregation were associated with engineering or the iron trade. One, James Foreman, founded a successful civil engineering practice specializing in railway work, building lines out to Greenock and to Weems Bay, and also the Glasgow Central line that came through the West End in due course. They also designed one of the city's most flamboyant bridges across the Kelvin up at Kirklee, these big granite columns. Another engineering-based trustee was John Ingalls, a founding partner in the well-known shipbuilding firm of A&J Ingalls, whose Point House yard stood for a century at the mouth of the Kelvin, today where Riverside Museum is. A&J Ingalls built a wide variety of vessels and probably are best remembered now for the Maid of the Loch up at Balloch and, of course, the PS Waverley. One particularly important trustee was the chairman of the building committee here, David Law. Law was an iron founder who worked his way up in the famous firm of Thomas Eddington and Son, one of the great early foundries here in Glasgow. He started out as a counting house manager in the 1820s, was a partner in the 1840s, and became sole proprietor in the late 50s. Like most foundries, Phoenix produced a wide range of goods, but it was at David Law's insistence that they began to specialize in gas and water pipes, producing vast quantities not just for the Lochcatron system here locally, but also for disparate cities such as Dublin, Brooklyn, Calcutta, and St. Petersburg. One of the more intriguing references to the work of the Phoenix Foundry that I've come across is this little snippet from the Dundee Advertiser in 1866, mentioning a Honeyman-designed iron church for British Guiana. Now, the project doesn't appear in the Hunterian collection where they have the Honeyman job books, so perhaps it was never built. Also, the fact that David Law went bankrupt in 1866 may have had something to do with it. It seems that in that very year, David Law got caught up in the famous rigging of the Scotch pig iron market, or pig rig gate, as we might call it today. But it was not just Law's leading role in the building of the new church that was vitally important, but also his generous contributions were greatly appreciated by the fellow parishioners and noted in the minutes as such. Gifts such as iron railings from the Phoenix Foundry, no doubt, and also for the early installation of stained glass windows, particularly in the western elevation. These windows designed by the leading firm of Ward and Hughes in Glasgow, of London, I should say. No Glasgow firms were invited to tender, as far as we know. And the Law Memorial windows that were in memory, actually, of his daughter, depict Christ in the central lancet, flanked by Moses and Elijah, and are rather light and airy compared to Alf's later works, but were very much in keeping with Honeyman's early English Gothic. So how do we know so much about, or how do I know so much about the history of Lansdowne Church? Well, it's primarily due to the archives that have survived from the day, Session Clerk minutes and the building committee minutes. We don't have construction period minutes, unfortunately. We have no documentation for the actual construction for the church. Really, the minutes start from the opening Sunday and continue on really almost through to the present day. So with these records that are now in the city archives, we can chart the early use, the management of the Lansdowne Church, how its fortunes ebbed and flow in the context of a growing and then declining population here in the northwest corner of Glasgow. Of course, events both within and out with the church had an impact on the management of the building, and for this reason, the study of a single prominent building can often provide interesting insights into the history of a neighborhood, of a city, or the country itself over time. Of course, we can see how the new church itself overcame early teething problems, and generally how it was maintained, altered, improved, and ultimately how it aged over the decades. The conditions of the interior, for example, of the sanctuary and the ancillary spaces were a regular issue for the building managers, and in the minutes we have references to contractors such as the Orr brothers in the early 1870s and C.T. Bowie and Fisher undertaking redecoration some 20 years later. Hopefully the on-site investigations by David Robertson and Alan Ferdinand and the 4 Acres Charitable Trust will ultimately reveal more detail about these early decorative schemes. Issues of poor ventilation and poor lighting in the sanctuary appear regularly in the minutes from around the 1870s, when additional gaseliers and ornamental pendants were being proposed, and these issues went on for years and years and years. In the early 1890s, there was talk of installing electric lights, but ultimately it was decided to wait until the costs came down for this expensive new technology. So it was not for another 20 years that electricity was fully installed in the building, this time part of a major overhaul of the church in time for its 1913 Jubilee. One major change literally on Lansdowne's doorstep at the time was the replacement of the old Great Western Bridge, that old stone bridge, which by the 1880s was far too narrow to cope with trams and other modern types of traffic. In order to undertake these works, protracted negotiations were required between the Joint Committee for the Bridge and the Lansdowne managers over a lease of church lands across North Woodside Road, just to that side, in order to accommodate the temporary timber crossing, which you can see there alongside the new road at its opening. And there's the timber crossing vaulting across at the cornerstone ceremony. Also, to avoid an impossibly tight 90-degree bend off Great Western Road for the tram lines, the Bridge Committee requested a temporary right-of-way cutting across the southwest corner of the church's front garden to provide these temporary tram lines with a gentler sweep. After much hesitation, this was agreed by the church managers with the obvious condition that the pavements, railings, and gardens were to be reinstated to the previous state. However, at the end of the works, the Bridge Committee cheekily asked that the truncated church gardens could be left as they were. Needless to say, the managers rejected this out of hand, as they should. Around the same time, a more existential threat confronted the managers when a succession of bills for new underground railways went before Parliament in the late 1880s. The first Glasgow Subway Bill, which proposed a shallow tunnel under Great Western Road, appeared to pose a real risk to the structural stability of the building, particularly Honeyman's tall spire. However, this bill failed in the Lords, and by the time it was revived in the early 1890s, the new Glasgow Railway Company had usurped the line underneath Great Western Road for its railway. And of course, the engineers for that railway were Formans and McCall, with Mr. McCall being a trustee here. So when the second subway bill came along, the competing bill, a few years later, the new underground line was diverted away from the church at Park Road. So instead of going this way and threatening the church, it had to sweep that way, going underneath the Kelvin and deep underneath Hillhead over to Byers Road. And there's the Glasgow Centre line coming underneath Kelvin Grove alongside the old mineral yards, now the Park and Ride, and then usurping that line under Great Western Road to the west, which the subway company wanted to do. Again, there's another whole talk about Glasgow Railways. Ask John Hume during the break, and he'll tell you about it. That's the Kelvinbridge station platform, by the way. At the same time, oh yes, this is quite interesting. Although they had many inconveniences to deal with, the Lansdowne managers had to deal with some conveniences as well. They were greatly perturbed by the town council's plans in 1896 to erect a urinal in the neighborhood of the Kelvinbridge, and the site that was selected was immediately fronting Lansdowne Church. The meeting considered that a strong representation should be made against such an unwarranted proceeding and directed the Church Repairs Committee to take steps to oppose it. Hear, hear. Needless to say, they got their way, and the area was denied the opportunity to host one of these elegant Glasgow-built cast-iron structures. But of all the issues confronting Lansdowne in the first 50 years, nothing caused the managers, parishioners, and architects more consternation, frustration, and expense than the conditions of the church's soft sandstone. As early as 1865, less than 2 years after the church's opening, Trustee William Walls reported to the Repairs Committee that the exquisite carving by James Shanks and William Mossman was beginning to decay. Unfortunately, it's not always clear from the minutes what action was taken over the course. For years, there was a regular pattern of concerns being raised, advice being sought, estimates obtained, but little, if anything, was actually done or recorded in the minutes. Things came to a head in the 1880s and again in the early years of the 20th century, when the managers sought the advice of the architect, the original architect, John Honeyman, and laterally his partner and successor, John Keppie. Both men took similar action, inspecting the church conditions, following by a detailed report outlining priorities and a plan of action. In one report, Honeyman provided the managers with a degree of comfort, stating, quote, "There is nothing wrong with the structure, and it would probably stand safely without anything being done to it for many years. Indeed, I may venture to say, for many hundreds of years, till in short the stones mouldered away." What he did suggest was a campaign of repointing with lime mortar, quote, "on the principle that a stitch in time saves 9. Curiously, what Honeyman also recommended for the joints, particularly for the projecting stone courses, was to cover over the newly pointed joints with a line of paint. You can see his little diagram there, presumably to further seal the joint in the stonework. However, when Keppie became involved, the problems were essentially still there. When he went up and did a report in 1906, he did the same thing, close inspection, but his advice would maybe rather make the blood run cold in today's conservation community. Keppie wrote, "The accumulation of soot and dirt retaining the dampness will help considerably to increase the disintegration of the stone, so I think they should be thoroughly brushed off with wire brushes. The pointing where the loose masonry should be raked out, loose pointing should be raked out, all the open joints should be repointed with Portland cement, so that the proportion being 1 of Portland cement to 1 of sharp sand. As these operations will make the building somewhat patchy, I would advise that the whole of the outside stonework up to the start of the spire at least should be recoated with stone preservatives." Thankfully, it was noted in the Repair Committee minutes that as these improvements indicated were not considered to be urgent and were very expensive, the meeting decided to postpone them at present. It seems that the congregation around this time was wanting to save money to undertake a comprehensive program of improvements in preparation for the church's upcoming jubilee in 1913. In addition to the installation of new electric lighting, improved heating and ventilation, general repainting and cleaning, several major schemes were made to the interior, including the installation of a new organ, replacing the apparatus that had been installed in the 1880s. The new organ arrangement with the console and all pipework removed to the rear gallery allowed the managers to make radical improvements to the chancel, namely the removal of Honeyman's, quote, "elegant pitch pine screen of tabernacle work" that had been installed in the summer of 1864. This unique view of the Honeyman screen, shown here retrofitted with the 1880s organ pipes, is also interesting as it shows the inlaid marble base of the pulpit, which, as can be seen in the following views, was to be converted into a communion table that served the community, the congregation for the next century. Strangely, despite the comprehensive alterations to the chancel area during these 1911 works, very little was recorded in the minutes. But the managers did commission the leading architectural photographer of the day, Harry Bedford Lemire to record the new oak paneling, the new choir pews, the pulpit and the font, and also that converted communion table. The interior would change again in just a few years as a memorial to the dead of the Great War was added to the chancel by the local sculptor James Young, with a mural frieze by the artist Evelyn Beale. The various proposals for the memorial seemed to preoccupy the minds of the Lansdowne managers for many, many years. It was not until the mid-1920s that these works were installed. Rather more surprising was the fact that another even greater change that we've been hearing about, a change of the appearance, the ambience, and the legacy of Lansdowne, was noted in the minutes with little more than a passing reference in May of 1913. Quote, "The moderator intimated that, in the view of the fact that this year is the Jubilee year of the dedication of Lansdowne Church, certain members of the congregation had expressed to him their desire to celebrate the occasion by a gift of stained glass windows. These generous members were the Mrs. Templeton of 6 South Park Terrace and Mr. and Mrs. McCowan of 9 Park Shirkus Place. It is the desire of the Mrs. Templeton to fill the 3 lights of the north transept and Mr. and Mrs. Cowan to fill those of the south, the new windows to be dedicated to the glory of God and as memorials of deceased members of their families." There's no mention in the minutes of the costs, the artist, or any brief, nor do they record exactly when Alf Webster's windows were installed and dedicated. But we know from contemporary sources and inscribed dates in the glass itself, the Templeton window to the north was in place by December 1913, and the McCowan in the south a year later. The donors of the former were spinster daughters of James Templeton, one of Lansdowne's long-serving elders, and a manager at Archibald Orr Ewing's United Turkey Red Company Limited, Fergus, Scotland's leading cotton processing firm. These 3 tall lancets depict scenes from the life of Christ, here we go, such as the life of Christ, and is surmounted by a trefoil, which we can't see here, depicting the Nativity. It is remarkable that despite the outstanding artistry of the 1913 Templeton window in the north transept, in his subsequent design for the McCowan window, Alf still managed to surpass himself and produce a work of indisputable genius. Donor Sir David McCowan, later first Baronet of Dalwit in Dumfriesshire, was a senior partner in the celebrated firm of Messrs. William Ewing and Company, marine insurance brokers and underwriters. He was also a director of Burma Oil, a company founded by his father-in-law, Sir David Cargill. The McCowans were well-known philanthropists in Glasgow, and Sir David was honoured for his work in Lansdowne with a plaque that's in the vestibule out front. The McCowan window depicts 6 events commemorated in Holy Week, including in the left lancet, there we go, in the left lancet, Paul preaching to a group of sinners, with the skyline of London representing the city of the damned looming in the background, and as David Robertson will tell you later, a Blakean avenging angel threatening the sinners with its mighty sword. At the top of the central light is a crucifixion with an anguished Christ flanked by 2 ascending angels and watched by a crowd of temporal leaders below. At the bottom panel shows Lansdowne Church as the backdrop to the penitent sinners receiving communion from an angel. At the bottom of the right lancet is a scene depicting Palm Sunday as a crowd welcomes Jesus into Jerusalem, here represented by Glasgow City Chambers and other city landmarks. And it's in that crowd that we've seen before a young Gordon Webster. I wish I had more time to revel in the beauties of this building and the staggering brilliance of Alf Webster, but to close, I'd like to note that despite the fact that today Alf Webster is a relatively unsung talent in the pantheon of great Scottish artists, his sublime Glasgow windows in Lansdowne were certainly well appreciated at the time of his premature and tragic death. For example, the Scottish Ecclesiological Society described, quote, "the work of our late beloved and gifted member, Mr. Alfred Webster, these works being a worthy memorial of his genius." Reverend David Watson, Alf's own minister at nearby Woodside Parish Church, or the Tesco Church, led a moving tribute in regard to this Lansdowne work, stating that he could not have done more, however long his life had been. And would readily concur with the stained glass scholar Michael Donnelly, who has said that, taken together, the Lansdowne windows were among the crowning achievements of Scottish stained glass. And I might possibly add that Alf's achievements here, as well as that of our friends Johnny Honeyman and John Eadie, altogether make Lansdowne Church nothing short of glorious. Thank you very much.